This is James Cox of SilverMoneyFuture, and today we have a very special guest on the line, Dr. Edwin Vieira. Dr. Vieira is a US constitutional expert, and today we shall be discussing the topics of the US dollar and the Federal Reserve. First of all, Dr. Vieira, would it be possible just to hear a little bit about yourself and your background, and also at what point did you become interested in the topic of money?
Well, my background is somewhat diverse on this subject. I went to Harvard College and Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. I studied chemistry. Eventually obtained a doctorate in chemistry. And during that period of time, I had a number of friends who were still in Harvard College or had come back in with other graduate departments of the university. And many of them were interested in political subjects, as young men tend to be, some of them going to the law school. So we used to have long discussions in our quote-unquote spare time on these subjects. And as a result of that, I became something of an autodidact, and I studied political science and especially economics. And then realized after spending some time working as a scientist with the U.S. Navy, that really the problems of this country were not going to be solved by scientists, at least in the near term. They need to be solved by people in the area of political science and really constitutional principles, constitutional law. So I went to Harvard Law School. And after leaving Harvard Law School, I spent a number of years, 20-something, 30-something years in legal practice, focusing on constitutional questions. Took a number of cases to the Supreme Court of the United States and various other high-level courts. And after doing that for a generation, slightly more than a generation, I finally came to the conclusion that it was extraordinarily difficult for what I would call a proper or really orthodox constitutional law to be accomplished in this country. The courts were really very antagonistic. They didn't fit a certain establishment paradigm, which was what they call the living constitution, which is essentially not a constitution at all. It's a body of supposed law that they make up as they go along. And at that point, I turned to writing. The idea being, I think it was Schumpeter that described the process through which intellectuals put out ideas, and then those ideas are popularized, and eventually you have some kind of political reform resulting as a consequence of that process. So that's really what I'm trying to do now. I have been trying to do for a number of years, focusing on money, because obviously that's central to the whole economic system. And then more recently, I've been dealing with questions of what we call in this country homeland security, because obviously that's coming to the fore as a response to what they see, what the establishment sees as the social, political, and economic consequences of the breakdown of the international monetary system.
Okay, and that's fascinating. We'll come back to that in a minute. Why is it that you have focused so much of your career on money, and why is it so important for people to understand this?
Well, I started focusing on money because if one studies constitutional law, you'll see that some of the major decisions made by the Supreme Court that had terrific effect, negatively in most cases, were focusing on money or banking or a combination of money and banking. And then, of course, of doing that kind of study, of course, I went into the area of economics in great depth. And one discovers, as soon as you start studying economics, that market economy, at least, the economy is driven by market prices. Money is of fundamental importance. What its composition is, who creates it, who controls it, and so forth. So putting those two things together was, in a sense, just kind of a natural occurrence in my own mind. Obviously, the two went hand in hand. And then you see, of course, as a practical matter, the consequence in this country of the disjunction between monetary policy and constitutional law. And all the problems we have with money and banking can be traced back at one point or another to a failure of the system, in many instances of the Supreme Court, to enforce the Constitution with respect to the limitations on government relating to money and the involvement of government in banking operations.
Okay. And would you be able to lay out the legal case against the Federal Reserve And in so doing, could you also enlighten us as to what kind of damage do you believe the Federal Reserve has caused? But first of all, what is the legal case against it?
Well, the first thing you have to understand about the Federal Reserve is it is what economists would call a corporative state structure. It's basically a cartel operation. And what has happened, and what happened initially, was that the government created this private cartel and gave it the authority to emit its own currency, Federal Reserve notes. And at that time, from 1913 to 1933, Federal Reserve notes were redeemable in gold. But there was an ultimate responsibility of the U.S. Treasury to redeem those notes if the banks failed. So you had what I call a symbiotic or incestuous relationship created between private banking cartel and the United States government. And in effect, that created an official status for Federal Reserve notes. They were quasi-governmental currency. So simply looking at it from the point of view of the currency, we have a problem because the United States Constitution does not allow the government in Washington, the central government, or the state governments to emit bills of credit. That's the term that the founding fathers in this country used for paper money, bills of credit. So we have the government creating a cartel structure that's emitting bills of credit ultimately guaranteed by the Treasury. That's problem number one. Problem number two is the legal tender status of these things. They have now been given the ability, actually they were given the ability in 33 and 34, to be forced upon unwilling users of money. Now, there are ways that you can avoid that. At least since 1978 in this country, one can make what are called gold clause contracts, in which you specify that the payment has to be made in gold or silver or some particular currency. So it is possible to circumvent that system. For some people, it's rather cumbersome, but some people can do it. But one has to remember that from 33 to 78, those kinds of contracts were illegal. So Congress has taken the position that it can force these private banknotes on people as essentially official currency, and there's nothing you can do about it.
And by private banknotes, can we just be clear? You're referring to the Federal Reserve note.
Yes, Federal Reserve note.
That most people refer to as...
We have no other banknote in this country.
Sure, which most people refer to as...
That issue their own notes, but there's a tax on those. There had been a tax on those since the Civil War, and the issuance of those notes has been effectively suppressed. There are no state banknotes anymore.
Okay.
So we have one form of bank currency, and that's coming out of this centralized cartel. And that's the third problem in this system, is the cartel structure. Because what has essentially happened is Congress has purported to delegate certain of its powers over money to this private organization. And there was a similar system that was set up under the Roosevelt administration in 1933. It was called the National Industrial Recovery Act, and it attempted to do the same thing throughout American industry. Within each type of production, there was what was called a code authority, which was analogous to the Federal Reserve System. And all of the major industrial players in that area, say steel, for instance, were made part of the Steel Code Authority. Then the Code Authority had delegated power to set prices for production and other activities, economic activities, and these effectively had the power of law behind them. Well, that system went to the United States Supreme Court. It was challenged, and the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional in 1935. They said this delegation of power by Congress to private parties is unknown to our law. That's an exact quote, unknown to our law. There's no way that this could consist with the U.S. Constitution. Now, of course, the problem for us with respect to the banking system is the Federal Reserve System was not part of the National Industrial Recovery Act. It was part of the Federal Reserve Act, which had been passed in 1913. The National Industrial Recovery Act was passed in 1933. So, in a sense, the constitutional question about the Federal Reserve slipped through the cracks, and it was never raised. And I'm fairly convinced that it never will be raised because the courts are very, very leery of trying to interfere in any way.
Okay,
and
you're suggesting then that the same logic should have applied to the Federal Reserve, as in it is unknown to our law?
Oh, yes. In fact, if you go back to the legislative debates on the Federal Reserve Act, talking about 1911, 1912, because the act was passed in 1913, the act was passed at the end of 1913. You will actually see, if you read those debates, you will actually see at least one that's very, very clear, where one representative comes out and says, wait a minute, if we did the same thing we're doing for these banks, for industrial concerns like the railroads or whatever, it would be clearly invalid. He saw what the structure was.
Okay.
But they passed it anyway. And then when the time came for the Supreme Court actually to hear a case on that type of system, the one that came before them dealt with the industrial cartels. It did not deal with the banking cartel.
All right. And just for our listeners, can we be clear then that there's a huge difference between the Federal Reserve notes and the US dollar? And in so doing, could you tell us, what is a US dollar in strict legal terms for the US?
Well, sure. In strict constitutional terms, the United States dollar is a particular weight of silver in the form of coin. And I can tell you the exact weight, 371 1/4 grains of silver. If you go back in American colonial history, when the colonies were subject or part of the British Empire, here in the colonies, as a result of a proclamation of Queen Anne in 1704 and a statute that was passed by Parliament in 1707, the Spanish milled dollar, that was the name it was given to it. Actually, it's a German term, comes from Joachimsthaler in Bavaria, I believe. But in any event, the Spanish milled dollar was made the standard of all foreign coins in the colonies. And that was because the colonies had a terrific amount of trade with Spanish America. The mints of Peru and Mexico were turning out these silver coins. So when the War of Independence came along, and the Continental Congress was now in essentially the central government, a weak central government, the question was, well, what are we going to use as our monetary unit, separate from the British pound, obviously? And Thomas Jefferson proposed the monetary unit that was actually being used in the colonial economy, which was the Spanish milled dollar, adopted by the Continental Congress. And then when the Constitution is written, that word dollar appears in two places, in Article 1, Section 9 and the Seventh Amendment. It's not defined. Well, it had to be defined because everyone knew what it was. And the first Congress under the Constitution is elected. And now Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury and Jefferson was Secretary of State, and they agreed on one thing, was that they needed to determine what this dollar really was out there in the marketplace. And so they had what I would call statistical analysis done. They sent some merchants out into the field and brought in a sample of the types of dollar coins that were really circulating, from the pristine ones to the fairly worn ones. And they did chemical analysis, and they came up with an average weight. The average weight of a dollar in the marketplace was determined and put into a statute, 371 1/4 grains. So that was a determination by Congress of the historical fact of what that word dollar meant in the Constitution. End of discussion.
And that has not been changed since.
It cannot be changed. You had to have a constitutional amendment to change it. All right? It
Okay.
cannot be changed. Now, banknotes in the 19th century were typically redeemable in some number of dollars. And they might have been paid in silver dollars, or they might have been paid in gold that was valued in dollars. So those notes were never treated themselves as being dollars. They were treated as banknotes, promises to pay, or as the Founding Fathers called them, bills of credit. All right? They were bills, that is some kind of note or promise, that was based upon the credit of the issuer, and the credit was supposed to be fulfilled by the payment at some point in time of the actual commodity money in the form of gold and silver. And, of course, the problem you had with the banking system then, just as you have now, was they were operating on a fractional reserve principle, if you will, in which they did not keep enough gold or enough silver in their vaults to redeem all of the notes that they issued or lent into circulation. And that led invariably to bank runs and then what they call stringencies or panics as more and more banks failed. And the banks turned around to the government and said, we need some kind of governmental assistance, some kind of special legal privilege to protect us in these situations when we have overexpanded our note issuance and the public is coming to us and demanding redemption, which we can't fulfill, and we have to go into bankruptcy. And so you had what they called in those days suspension of specie payments, which essentially was the government said, well, these organizations, notwithstanding they can't pay their own creditors, will be enabled to continue in business and to collect from their debtors until at some point in time they get their books in order and they can finally begin redeeming their notes again. And that was really the beginning of a very dangerous, incestuous relationship between banks and government. And it was eventually, it was tied very early on. I should say eventually. It was tied early on by people like Hamilton, who said, we need to have the support of the banking and financial community behind the government, the ability of the Treasury to turn to these people to borrow money, basically, or self-stock. Government stock is the term that they often use. Government notes or bonds of one kind or another. We need to have this kind of close political, economic relationship. And I think in Hamilton's mind, the idea probably was that the government would be the dominant partner. But what has actually happened in history is, of course, the money lenders have become the dominant partner, such that they could go from a single bank of the United States, and we had two of those before the Civil War. Then the Civil War comes along. They created what was called the national banking system, which was a cartelized system, not quite the level of organization of the Federal Reserve, but that was directly tied into the United States Treasury. And that didn't work because you still didn't have a lender of last resort, so these panics continued to occur. So they gave us the full cartelized system in the Federal Reserve with the promise that once this has been set up, bank panics would end. We wouldn't have that anymore. Scientific management of the currency would occur. And, of course, 20 years after the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, you had the greatest depression the world had ever seen. And at that point, once again, there was the possibility that the government could have come in and said, no, we're going to end this close relationship between the Treasury and the banks, and we're going to impose strict controls, limitations on fractional reserve practices. But instead of doing that, under Roosevelt, they went in the opposite direction. They removed the gold redemption from Federal Reserve notes domestically. They kept it internationally. They made Federal Reserve notes legal tender. Roosevelt called in privately owned gold, since he stole that gold from the American people. And Congress outlawed contracts that were required to be paid in gold. So they gave even more power to the banking system. And then, of course, we know where that led eventually with Nixon in 1971. The banking system continued to deteriorate to where we are now.
So at that point, by 1933, the Federal Reserve note had illegally usurped gold as the dominant monetary amount in US law.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
There was still silver in the system, and people used silver.
Okay.
And there was a certain amount of U.S. Treasury paper that was redeemable in silver. But for all practical purposes, people were dealing in Federal Reserve currency from 1933 onwards.
Okay. And so to be clear one last time then, the Federal Reserve is illegal in U.S. constitutional law.
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that.
Okay. All right. And earlier, we were talking about fractional reserve banking. Now, is there a legal case against fractional reserve banking in terms of the US Constitution?
Well, I think there is in two senses. First, the government can't be involved in this process. You can't have this symbiotic or incestuous relationship between any kind of bank, or especially fractional reserve bank and the U.S. Treasury. But leaving that aside, let's assume we're talking about banks that are totally private and are not propped up by some kind of legal special privilege. Assuming that the bank is making full disclosure of its fractional reserve practices, and that would require, in my view, a great deal of disclosure. Not simply that they have fractional reserves, but it would also go to what sort of real reserves they have that might be used to pay off these fractional reserves when the notes are called for. But presuming that could be done, then I would say, well, there's really no problem about it, because if it's full disclosure, caveat emptor. If someone wants to use those notes knowing what the risk is, that's his problem. Now, of course, if the disclosure is not full, or if the bank reneges on its promise in some way, then you would have some kind of illegal, perhaps fraudulent commercial transaction, and there should be some kind of governmental regulation there, governmental control. There might be regulation in the sense of requiring certain kinds of disclosure. It might be civil consequences. It might be criminal consequences. But the only relationship between the government and the banks in that set of circumstances would be the government would be essentially performing a governmental role, making sure that those banks were giving full disclosure, and if they failed in some way, making them civilly or criminally liable.
And do you feel that fractional reserve banks these days do give full disclosure, that the public really understand what it is that they're dealing with?
I don't think they ever did.
Okay.
And the example I like to give is Franklin Roosevelt, 1933. He comes in as president, and he has closed the banks. Of course, they had the bank collapse. Officially, the banks are closed, and he's getting ready to steal the gold. And he goes on nationwide radio, his first fireside chat. This was a great innovation. President speaking to the country over the radio. And he explains what he did and why he had to close the banks. And his explanation is pretty simple. He's telling people, look, you may think that your money is there, but the banks don't keep your money in a box someplace in the back room. They take it and they lend it out. And that's the reason that they can't pay their notes, and you'll just have to wait until they can call in some of these other loans. And that, in a sense, that was an amazing admission by the President of the United States that the people of this country didn't understand what fractional reserve banking was. That they needed Franklin Roosevelt to go on nationwide radio to tell them, to explain this to them. Why didn't they know that already? Well, because the banks had never really made this terribly clear, and the politicians, people in office, had never required a clear statement of it. And I think it's worse today, because my impression, and it's of course only an impression because I wasn't alive in the 30s, but my impression looking back at that period, I think that the average American was probably a little more savvy about economic matters than he is today. Certainly the general level of education, by the time someone would have matriculated from a high school, let alone a college, in the 1920s or 30s, I think he had far more useful education between his ears than is the case today.
You may well be right. Okay. This brings us to the third part of our interview, Dr. Vieira, and that would be if we could make sure that the financial system was in accordance with the US Constitution and general Western legal tradition, how might it be implemented, and what would its advantages be for the general public as well as businesses?
Well, one of the first things that it would do, it would remove large amounts of what I would call political irrationality that are generated in the system today. Because we have a system that is responding to special interest groups in the private sector. That's really what the Federal Reserve was set up to do. And it's responding to political pressure. It enables the Treasury to monetize vast amounts of debt. And the short answer is you couldn't have the level of private and certainly public debt in this country if you didn't have this cartel banking system. So it has really destabilized not only the economic system at the higher levels and financiers and speculator levels, Wall Street types, but it's destabilized Main Street, and it's also destabilized the political system because now you have an unpayable public debt, and where is that going to lead us? So obviously, if we could correct all of this, we would tend to stabilize economically, we would stabilize politically, we would stabilize socially, because the consequence of an economic breakdown is going to be a tremendous amount of social dislocation in this country and other places in the world. That's number one. And then, of course, number two, this is a system, they talk about moral hazard. Most of these people don't have any morals.
Okay.
This is a system that rewards psychopathology. It rewards avarice. It rewards criminality. And the way to prove this is simply look what's happened with the banking system. This occurred in the Roosevelt administration. They go out on a limb. They use their special privileges to endanger the economic security of the entire country. And then they come to the government and say, well, surprise, if you don't bail us out, everything's going to go to hell in a handbasket. We're holding you hostage. We want more privileges, or as in the 30s, which is what they received, privileges, or today, we want direct bailouts. We want essentially bribes, otherwise we're going to sink the whole system. And I should think the response to that would be, well, we're not going to give you anything because we'll give you something now, the problem will be worse 10 years down the road. So we've got to bite the bullet at this point in time. But they're now in a position where they hold the whole country hostage to this system. They're like a vampire. We can't get rid of them, right? Without the cross through the stake through the heart. All right.
So what is it?
If you ask that question, will we be better off? The answer is, well, of course. But the problem is, how do you do it?
How do you do it? That's my question then. You've already made some steps in terms of creating systems that the US government could start implementing now. Do you think you could tell our listeners about that?
Well, there are systems that could be implemented under the Constitution. Some people talk about the U.S. government, they mean the government in Washington. I don't have a great deal of confidence, let alone faith, in Congress. Congress is pretty much the puppet of the financial interests we've seen over the last 4, 5, 10 years. So I don't expect that there will be reform coming out of Congress. And also the problem with reforming the Federal Reserve System is I don't think we really know how to do it. I think the market needs to correct most of these problems. But to enable the market to do that, you have to give the market a sound, a rational, a free market-controlled monetary unit, which is not what we have. We have a political monetary unit, politically controlled monetary unit. And Congress is simply not going to give us that unit. It could, but I don't think it will. But we have 50 other legislators in our federal system. Each state has its own legislature. Each state has a certain amount of sovereign autonomy, if you will. And one of those areas, and this was actually decided by the United States Supreme Court in the 1800s, shortly after the Civil War, one of those areas of autonomy that's reserved to the states is the right of each state to choose for itself what monetary unit it wants to use in the performance of its governmental functions. And the issue in one of those cases, actually there were two specifically on this point, that came to the Supreme Court, was whether states could be required to accept, in payment of taxes, legal tender treasury notes, which were the equivalent after the Civil War of the Federal Reserve note today, legal tender paper currency put out under the auspices of Congress. And the Supreme Court said no. If the states want to receive gold coin or gold bullion or things, tax in kind, as the expression goes, they can do this. They are not bound by what Congress may have set up as a general medium exchange for people out there in the marketplace. So it's certainly possible today for a state to come along and say, we're going to adopt a unit of gold, a unit of silver, or a combination of the two as our state monetary unit. And we will start off by collecting a certain amount of taxes, and that's what will prime the pump. And then we'll take that gold-silver fund and pay it out to the creditors, first come, first served. And what I would expect would happen is that more and more people in the private market, either the ones who are paying the taxes or the ones who are receiving the gold and silver as state creditors, will start using, offering, or demanding in their own private transactions to use that alternative currency. And the market will drive the system in the direction in which the state is collecting more and more of its taxes in gold and silver, and the people are using more and more gold and silver in their ordinary commercial transactions. And the system will simply move away from Federal Reserve notes. And the beauty of that is it will let the market set up an alternative system of prices at what the market believes is the appropriate rate to do that. So that if it turns out that the Federal Reserve System now becomes managed by Mr. Bernanke or whoever gets in his position in an intelligent manner and no longer poses an economic threat, well, this kind of an alternative system will essentially sit there and no one would use it. On the other hand, if the Federal Reserve System continues to deteriorate, the market will move us away at a quicker pace from Federal Reserve note prices to gold and silver prices. And the beauty of that is we won't have what essentially would be a crash that would leave us with no price structure, such as hyperinflation along the lines of what happened in Weimar Germany. It's of course the last thing we want to have happen. If we're going to transition out of this, if we're going to change it, if we're going to reform the system, we have to transition out of it in an economically rational manner. And the only way to determine what that is to put a system like this into the marketplace and let the marketplace tell us how fast and how far we should move with it.
And that's an incredibly important thing that we really should be setting up, in my opinion, some sort of alternative economic system, financial system, in case this one breaks down. You know, it's looking increasingly likely that it might break down, and at the moment, we don't really have all that much in its place to take over.
Well, I don't see anyone out there who is sanguine about the continuation of this system as it now exists.
Okay.
Right? They're all looking at it and saying, we're going to have a crisis of one kind or another. There are those folks who talk about depression and folks talk about hyperinflation. I'm sort of in the hyperinflation followed by depression camp as a predictor, if you will. No one can be sure of this. But it will be some kind of a critical or even catastrophic result. And I look at it as a Titanic type of situation with one difference. Because on the Titanic, ships going down, no help could come in time. They didn't have enough lifeboats. Our situation is essentially the same in terms of the danger. The ship's going down. No one is going to come to help us. But we have the opportunity to build some more lifeboats.
Right.
At least in the United States, we can do this to the federal system at the state level. One state at a time, perhaps. Maybe it'll only be one, and that will be the exemplar for the others. But we have that opportunity. And so it would seem to me that it would be imprudent in the extreme not to do this somewhere, so that at least we could test it.
Sure.
And see what the effect would be. I mean, it's like automobile insurance. People buy hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of automobile insurance, not on the anticipation that they're going to run over a little blind girl in a wheelchair in the crosswalk. No one intends to do that. But if that ever happens, you bloody well better have that $500,000 worth of liability insurance. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, who goes out driving a car without liability insurance?
You're right. And then,
even though no one ever expected it to happen. Now we're looking down the track and we see this train coming at us at high speed. One would think that we would take the step of saying, well, at least I'm going to put one of my legs on the other side of the track.
Sure. Okay. And I think the analogy with the Titanic and building some lifeboats really resonates with a lot of our listeners. Well, thank you very much for answering these three questions. And just to finish off, as we do with all of our guest speakers, just a few straightforward yes-no questions. The first few, I believe that we can cover fairly quickly, so we'll have more time for the last few. Very quickly then, should fiat money be allowed?
Only with complete disclosure and total responsibility of the people issuing it.
Should central banks be allowed?
That's essentially the same question as fiat money, because what central banks essentially do is to generate fiat money to support the banks lower down in the system.
Okay. And moving on then, will the US dollar, and you corrected me the other day, as defined by the Federal Reserve Note, see 2020?
I would be surprised if it did, in the form that it now exists.
In the form that it now exists.
Right, it might exist as a curiosity. It did get hyperinflation, it would exist as a curiosity there.
Sure.
But it certainly will not exist in the form that it now has, in my view.
Okay. And if it won't see 2020, would you dare to hazard a guess at what year is it going to fold?
No, but I would suspect that big problems are going to begin to occur in 2013, 2014. The difficulty here is you can't really answer this one yes or no or give a year, because there are so many emergency types of regulations that the Treasury might try to put in to forfend the collapse. Price controls, international capital controls. They haven't done any of these things yet, but they will try. And all that will do is exacerbate the situation. I mean, that's not going to solve it. But they could hold it off for a while, which means that the final collapse would be worse.
Okay. And if you had to put the dominoes in order, in terms of which currency you think will fold first, and if you see any of these currencies living past 2020, then please feel free to say so. Here there are four major ones: the British pound, the US Federal Reserve Note dollar, the yen, and the euro.
Yeah, I think the euro's in the worst position right now.
Why's that?
And then, of course, the yen, the Japanese economy is in bad shape, but they may make a deal with the Chinese. But assuming they don't do that, I would say the yen is the next worst. The third is the British pound, and I think that the advantage that the pound has is, well, the UK has always been somewhat leery and standoffish of the European Union, and there's this special relationship between London and New York, which has gone on for a long time. Mm-hmm. And then the US Federal Reserve Note, in first place, for a while because people will be shifting capital into U.S. treasuries in the hopes that they won't lose their capital. They may not make any interest, but at least they won't lose their capital. And in the long run, I think people are going to look at this as a matter of the United States has a tremendous amount of military power. That's what really is backing up this currency.
Wow.
It's military force and the ability to intervene all over the world and manipulate the resource markets or threaten to manipulate resource markets with military force. So we're getting to a kind of situation where it's not the money that's the dominant factor. It's the military force that shores up the money.
Wow. Okay. So in your opinion, then, the US Federal Reserve note is not inherently any particularly better shape than the Japanese yen, for example, but it does have the military capacity to hold things up for a while.
Yeah, for a while. I mean, it's like a leaking lifeboat. You go from one that doesn't have as big a hole to one that has a big hole to one that has less, but they're all going to sink eventually.
Okay.
And actually, it's the military thing that will bring the United States down because of the 60. I think it's more than 60% now of the U.S. discretionary budget is Pentagon-related spending. And that's the vicious nature of this thing.
So they've kind of got themselves in a deathlock with the military spending, in that the US dollar doesn't exist without the military spending, and yet the military spending is going to...
It doesn't exist without the U.S. dollar. Yeah, that's right. It's one of those chicken and egg problems, which I don't think they're going to be able to solve, because ultimately, if you don't have a rational price structure, you're not going to be able to have the production level necessary to maintain the 21st century military. And how can you have a rational price structure without a rational monetary unit?
And in your opinion, then, if we take the logic a bit further, the market, in the end, eventually, when all's said and done, is what decides what money is and what it's worth, not government intervention.
That's always been true throughout history. This would be the first time in world history where that didn't work out, right?
I would agree.
In the long run, it's always proven true. So one can only go on empirical evidence here. I don't think, we were told in 1913 that they had solved this problem, scientific monetary management. And ever since then, we've had one crisis after another, and every crisis becomes worse.
And this problem
and that's the market simply saying, no, you people are not managing things scientifically. The only scientific way to manage an economy is through the information system that the market provides.
And that's interesting that you say that, in that information is speeding up at an ever greater rate. I mean, just this interview that we're doing on Skype from UK to the US was not available, so easily 10 years ago, say.
And the more information there is, the more difficult it is to manage it through a central mechanism. That's the beauty of the market. The market system can handle essentially any information load. Whereas central management and all of these forms of central banking and treasury banking symbiosis are based on a model that comes out of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, basically a socialist, fascist-type model, which was proven in the early 20s. You had people like Mises pointing out, wait a minute, you have an information problem here.
Sure.
These central planners cannot, no matter what kind of computers they have, because most of that information is not available to them. It occurs only in the course of an immediate transaction down there somewhere in the marketplace. By the time that information about the transaction gets to the central planners, it's out of date. And that's, of course, becoming more and more true in this highly technological and information-rich society we're living in.
Okay. And well, let's take advantage of this highly technical age that we live in. What things can listeners actually do themselves? Because, we've just listened to an interview about some very powerful forces out there looking after themselves, and the little guy is often left thinking, well, what am I meant to do?
Well, in terms of monetary reform, what the little guy needs to do is to get to his state legislators and make this a state legislative issue.
Okay.
And because the difficulty there is most state legislators simply don't think about this kind of an issue. They expect that these problems will somehow be solved in Washington by the Federal Reserve or the Treasury or whomever. and make it into a political issue at the level at which monetary matters were political issues even in the 1930s or earlier at the turn of the 20th century. Because the average man is the one who stands to lose most here in terms of his basic standard of living.
And what can he do to defend that basic standard of living?
Well, I think he has to get out of dollar-denominated assets to the extent that he can.
And into what?
There definitely has to be a significant amount of gold and silver in his portfolio, in his possession.
In his
You don't want to
possession?
be involved. Yeah, in his possession. You don't want to be involved in these electronic gold funds. They'll disappear. You know, we know about Mr. Corzine and so forth. You don't want to be involved, I think, also in gold that's sitting in a safety deposit box in a bank. They'll close the banks, and that's the end of that.
Wow.
Now you have no control over it. It has to be out of the institutional control of the establishment, and that means personal possession of some kind. Obviously, you can have it in some kind of secure storage. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a shoebox under your bed, but it certainly should not be left in the custody of this banking system by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay.
And that would eventually tell me that, well, the average man, he's not going to be holding, bullion bars. He's going to be holding relatively small denomination coins, especially because if we do have a hyperinflationary event or a depressionary event or a combination of the two, there will be, for some significant amount of time, a great deal of economic and social dislocation, and those will be the only things in the long run that will be usable as actual money, and that actually may cause us to come back to a gold and silver economy from the bottom up, as it were. So you should be prepared for that. That means things along the lines of what used to be called junk. That's what it still is, junk silver.
Mm.
The old United States coinage, quarters, dimes, $half of the pre-1964 standard, because those are recognizable, certainly by most Americans, and they're small enough so that the type of transaction that the average person would enter into could be easily affected. You're talking about a 1 ounce gold coin. What's 1 ounce, a coin ounce of gold today is what, 1,700 Federal Reserve notes, something like that. I didn't look at the price this morning. But that's a rather large-scale transaction. You're not going to be going to a grocery store and using a 1 ounce gold coin and receiving change for that.
Sure.
So looking at it for the average person, and in the long run, get out of debt, because one of the problems we have here is even if you have a hyperinflationary event, only if your income goes up equivalent with the hyperinflation are you able to pay off debts with depreciated currency. And many people find themselves, they're not able to do that. And then when the inevitable depression follows after the hyperinflation, now all of a sudden the real purchasing power value of their debts magnifies, and they get wiped out.
Okay.
So you have to protect against both the hyperinflationary event that destroys the price structure, currency unit, and therefore you have to have gold and silver potentially to be used as actual money, and then you want as much as possible to limit or eliminate, really, any debt that you have, significant debt that you have, so that you're not caught at the other end of that event in the depression.
Okay. And if our listeners would like to learn more about your work, where can they go?
Actually, the best place to go at the present time is the website newswithviews.com. One word, newswithviews.com. And you'll find on the homepage a list of contributors. My name is down there somewhere. Click on that name and you have a complete graveyard, as it were, of my articles from March of 2005. And you see, I've been talking about this for the past 9 years, at least on the internet. I was talking about it much earlier in print. So this is not something that I thought about yesterday.
Okay. Well, Dr. Vieira, it's been a fascinating interview. I'm sure we've all learned a great deal. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, I hope I've been able to help you. Thank you.
Thank you.